Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast is all about church planting in the Canadian context. So whether you are a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more about Canadian church planting, we believe this podcast is for you. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you're using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. I am so grateful that you have chosen to take a listen to this episode and to my next conversation. If you are being encouraged by this podcast, I would encourage you to engage with us on social media at the Sowers Pod. Once again, that is at the Sowers Pod. You can also send questions or make any comments to ask@thesowerspod.ca. I heard from somebody after our last episode with Jacques Avakian talking about the history of Quebec, of how on point they felt the episode was as they were reflecting on their own experience with extended family that are from Quebec. And so if you have not listened to that episode, I would highly encourage you to go and check that one out. Well, today I am excited, if you've not heard of him before, to introduce you to Daniel Yang. Daniel is the director of the Billy Graham Center's Church Multiplication Institute. That's formerly known as the Send Institute. Prior to directing the Institute, Daniel planted a church in Toronto where he also helped recruit, assess, and train church planters through the Send Network and the Release Initiative. Daniel is currently working on a PhD in intercultural studies from the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He also received his MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Daniel is one of three writers that contributed to a book titled Inalienable: How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church. Daniel is a real blessing, and I believe that you will be blessed as I was as you listen to this conversation and as I had it with Daniel Yang. Daniel, thank you so much for joining the Sowers Podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time to be part of this.
Yeah, Matt, thanks for having me. Appreciate you keeping track with me and letting me be on the podcast. So congrats to launching the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Daniel, many of our interviews have started with a person's reflection on their experience of coming to know Christ and then a little bit of their call to ministry. Could you share with us your coming to know Christ and then how, if that at all connected immediately to a call to ministry, or if that came a little bit later on?
Yeah. My parents are the first generation to be followers of Jesus. Ethnically, I'm Hmong. So as far as we know, history back, we'd never had a believer in Jesus in my family. My dad would be the first, and my mom would be the first on her side. So although I grew up in a Christian home, it was really a big change in the lineage of our family. And my parents were sponsored as refugees through a Lutheran church. And so I was introduced to Christ as a young kind of a kid. I went to Awanas, which is an amazing, kids program that teaches kids the Bible. And I made a decision for Jesus at an early age, but it was probably around 16 that I really felt like I understood faith as primarily a relationship and not just this, religious thing that my parents were a part of. So I had a little bit more distinction between what our family was and then also a personal relationship with Jesus. And then by the time I get to 21, I'm fast forwarding through a lot of things. 21 is probably when I started feeling a stirring that there must be more than what at the time was my vocational calling as an engineer. I started feeling a bit of a stir towards vocational ministry. But that's sort of the trajectory which eventually led me into vocational ministry.
Very cool. And so where did you begin? Where did that journey begin for you?
Well, I was a Engineer. I grew up in Detroit, and our church that I was a part of for 20 plus years, from childhood to adulthood, was an immigrant church. And as an engineer, became an assistant pastor in our church. And so I was a lay pastor. My pastor would say he was good for something. I was good for nothing because I didn't get paid. um, but the reality was that I was fully immersed in bivocational ministry as an assistant pastor in Detroit. And it was, I was probably about 24 or 25, Matt, when I started struggling with my faith in terms of questioning what I believed. It's interesting because I went through university years not struggling so much, but it was after I became a successful engineer. I had my house in the suburbs, 3 kids, driving my dream car, which was a Yukon Excel at the time. I came into sort of an existential crisis and started asking the questions like, suffering, what about those who have never heard? Not uncommon question, or very common questions. And that began a 2-year process of me essentially sort of deconstructing my faith. At the time, I didn't have that language for it, but that's really what I was doing. And I came pretty close to just saying, I don't know if I believe this anymore. And it was April 2004, leading up to Easter. I came on a website, ntrightpage.com or something like that. I had no clue what NT Wright was, like zero clue. I was just researching like the historicity of Jesus. And I sent him an email, and he responds to my email that week. Now, I didn't know it was a big deal at the time because I didn't know who he was at the time. And he basically responded to me and he said, "Hey, you've got too many questions for me. But either the resurrection happened and it must mean something, or it didn't happen and you can be on your way." It was a very British response. And he sort of gave me something to hang my hat on, really. And that slowly began a process of me re-investigating my faith. And 2 years after that, I went into seminary, and I started kind of putting the pieces together, sort of my background as an immigrant, and then also my own personal struggles with the intellectual questions about faith. And I realized that I wanted to be a missionary. I felt like there was a convergence of some of my own personal narrative that I thought that there must be others like me. And my wife and I stumbled on church planting, and I didn't have a great desire to be a pastor, even though I was serving as a lay pastor in my church. But that seemed to make sense for me in terms of the intersection with missions. So I grew up in a very foreign missions focused church. So church planting never really registered in terms of North American context. But that was, again, it was 2004, I started struggling my faith. And by the time I got to 2008 was when I felt like I had a clear call into church planting. So.
Wow. And you were still, during that whole season, were you in Detroit?
I was in Detroit. I was still working, a full-time career in engineering and doing bivocational ministry, as an assistant pastor, and then really trying to explore what it meant for me to have all this convergence of my own narratives coming together.
And so what happened? You are called to church planting. What did you do? Where did you look?
So you got to think back 2008 in the United States and a little bit in Canada, but 2008 is like the rise of the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. And so Acts 29 is essentially emerging. And so I was with the Christian Missionary Alliance. I grew up in the denomination and still a strong affinity towards them. So at the time, they didn't have locally a strong assessment process. And I knew that I wanted to go through a church planting assessment process. And so my wife and I went out to an Acts 29 boot camp and an assessment. And Scott Thomas, who was actually in Toronto for a few years, he was the president of Acts 29 at the time, and he was president at my assessment. And long story short, they looked at my wife and I and they said, "We don't doubt that you could plant a church or you should plant a church. We just don't think it's now. We think you need to get mentorship." And so their recommendation was a year internship. And So, which was kind of sort of discouraging, but it was so affirming because what I skipped over, Matt, was my first 10 years of marriage. Lynn and I, we man, we were married young, married at 19, had kids, boom, boom, boom. Our career, very involved in church, and by the end of our 10 years, which was the entry point into church planting, we were pretty burnt out. Mind you, I'm working, a 55, 60 hour a week full-time job as an engineer, and I'm an assistant pastor. I was also in seminary. In 2006, I enrolled in seminary. I came out of my doubting period saying, if I'm going to be a Christian, I'm going to know the Bible. There's too much going on. There's just way too much. And we didn't have proper mentorship. We had people who loved us, but we didn't have people who could process life with us. And the assessment picked up on that. And they said, we think you have the gifts for it. We just don't think this is the right time. At that point, we already had a team. And there's a lot of church planting lessons in my story. We already had a team. We already had funding. We had a venue. We were going to plant in the cool part of town. Again, think back, this is 2008. And had a good team and came back from that assessment and told our team, we don't think we're going to plant. And it was actually during that week that I got an invitation from someone who eventually became my mentor, Bob Roberts, who lived in Texas. And he said, hey, I don't know what you have planned, but would you consider coming down to Texas for a residency? And they were so disconnected, but the fact that it all happened in the same week, it was just kind of like, you wake up in the morning, you choose your cereal, you think you're in control of your life, but God really knows how to direct your steps. And that's really how we felt. So instead of planting in Detroit, we passed off our team to another planter, and then we came down to Dallas for a 3-year residency.
And so talk to me about then that 3-year residency and what would eventually become a call to Toronto. When did Toronto come on that scene, and how did that residency prepare you for that?
Yep, exactly what happened. We left Detroit. This would have been the end of 2009, early 2010. Came down to Dallas, came on staff at a church called Northwood Community Church, planted and pastored by Bob Roberts, who was a significant church planting leader. He and I knew each other through some other things that I was doing the previous year. So for me, at a personal level, it was an invitation for my family to step out of our immigrant church into a non-immigrant church, or, we would say a multi-ethnic church, and that, it doesn't sound scary, but for someone who grew up, 20 plus years in an immigrant church, it was scary because for most of us who have an immigrant background, like, the church isn't just the place of worship. It's your place of socialization. It's community, it's family, it's a place of identity. And so we left the immigrant church and we went to this white, affluent, suburban church in Republican Texas, by the way, which is not how I grew up. I'll say this, it was a bigger culture shock for us to move from Detroit to Dallas than it would have been for us to go from Detroit to Toronto. And the Lord really used that to help us and this is where Bob really challenged me, that prepared us for a city like Toronto, or at least gave us a better way of thinking about Toronto. And that was, he sat me down one time and he said, hey, you got to stop thinking like a minority and think like a global citizen. And there's a way to hear that and be offended. I don't think he was being condescending, but what Bob was essentially saying is that, you got to understand that, in some ways your background, your upbringing is a bit of a gift when it comes to the future reality of the global church here in North America. And that really gave me a different way to think about how to enter a city like Toronto, and to embrace both, being a part of a diaspora, but also at the same time having very much a North American experience. And my time at Northwood was invaluable. I mean, it was just, it really prepared us for our time in Toronto. And Bob is actually the person who eventually connected me with Jeff Christofferson. And at the time, it was Toronto Church Planting before it was Send Toronto. And they eventually sponsored essentially our religious work visa into Canada.
Talk to me then about Toronto. Why Toronto? Did you imagine at all going back to Detroit, or did the residency and mentorship, how did Toronto come onto the scene?
Yeah, I very much thought that it would have been Detroit. Bob at the time was really pushing me towards a global city. He had hoped that we went to Washington D.C. We did a vision trip out there, and it's a great city. I love it. I just didn't feel like the Lord was calling us to that. And really, I prayed with Linda, my wife, and I said, what cities do you feel like you'd be excited about raising our kids in? And people don't really realize this, but Detroit to Toronto is only 4 hours away. Detroit is closer to Toronto than Montreal is closer to Toronto. And so our families had done trips to, Niagara Falls and downtown Toronto and Chinatown and all that stuff. And we spent in 2007 some time, about a week in Toronto. And so that sort of registered on Linda's heart. And we did one vision trip with a group of people. We really liked it. And then our second vision trip was to meet with Toronto church planting folks. And one couple that we met with was Brett and Catherine Porter. And we met out in Mississauga where they were pastoring at the time. And I remember Catherine was sharing with my wife, Linda, about like just the challenges of being in a multi-ethnic space and the different foods and languages and all that stuff. And Linda turned over to me during that dinner with Brett and Catherine, and she said, I think we can do this. And that for me was kind of like the voice of the Holy Spirit. I was like, that's the release when Linda felt like, I think we can do this. And so that was probably the tail end of 2011. And we spent about 9 months getting ready to make our move.
Okay, so you eventually make your move then to Toronto. Share with us a little bit about then your experience in Toronto. What were some of the unique differences between, we talk about the country of Canada, but you spent most of your time in Toronto. So Toronto versus your experience in Detroit and then in Texas.
Yeah. At the human and the heart level, obviously, there's not tons of difference when it comes down to who we are as image bearers of God, and that's something that you can't forget, because the social layers that remind us how different we are oftentimes can dictate how we engage one another. And that's both how Canadians engage Americans and those who are not Canadians, and vice versa, how Americans might engage Canadians. And so I think obviously there were a lot of different social layers that we had to constantly filter through, and the national layer, which is Canadian American, identities, and then the Toronto being such a multi-ethnic city, having to go through the different cultural identities. I think probably the largest thing that was a challenge to myself, but then also was a disadvantage, but then it was also an advantage, was that at least in Toronto proper, there was like 0 Hmong people. Ethnically, I'm Hmong. My parents are from Laos. And in some ways, like, I felt like there was no chance that I could ever think that I would participate as majority culture in Toronto, because there's literally 7 of us that live in Toronto. And that to me was a disadvantage at times, because it made me feel lonely. But it was an advantage in the sense that, like, I would always prefer others. And I think that is pretty key when you do incarnational ministry. But that has to be an autonomous decision. When I say you have to prefer others, if you feel like you are being told to prefer others, as an American, you must prefer Canadians, or as an Asian, you must prefer, some other racial minority or ethnic minority, or white Canadians, or whatever it is, all the social layers. It can feel at times like you're being asked to give up too much of yourself. There was a moment, and it was probably about year 1 or year 2, where I felt like I'm doing incarnational ministry. I am like Jesus in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, to the Jew becoming a Jew, to the one under the law becoming under the law, to the weak becoming weak. And in finding that sense of agency, I felt like the cultural exegesis became a little bit more natural, because when my identity was primarily rooted as an American church planter, I just felt like the hurdles were too obvious. But when I looked at myself primarily as an incarnate missionary, or somebody whose identity was cosmic in a sense, then it put less of the pressure on the social identities, if that makes sense. And it became more about, how do I be a representative of the kingdom of God? And you're going to experience cultural stumbling blocks regardless of which context you go in when you look at it from that perspective. I think some Canadians felt a little bit more comfortable with me because I was from Detroit, which was not too far. I was a visible minority. And then also because I grew up in the inner city, I had a very urban sensibility. So those things helped a little bit too when it came to relating to Torontonians. I'd say specifically Torontonians more so than Canadians.
Friends, we will get back to my interview with Daniel Yang in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Wheaton College's Billy Graham Center. The center was established in 1980 and stands as a global hub for evangelism and mission training. With a commitment to develop and mobilize Christ followers for individual and corporate witness, the center boasts 9 specialized institutes dedicated to research, teaching, and fostering a world where every believer actively makes Jesus Christ known. If you'd like to learn more about the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, you can visit Wheaton, that's Wheaton, BillyGraham.com. WheatonBillyGraham.com. And now back to my interview with Daniel Yang. Can you provide an example for maybe an interaction that you would have had of the distinction that you just mentioned between seeing yourself through, the various social layers versus seeing yourself as a, citizen of King Jesus, made in his image, ministering to others that are also made in his image, and how that's distinct from the other identity that you briefly spoke to?
Yeah. So, the motif of living in exile was huge. And although the non-believers that we would encounter would probably not resonate with that language exile, they would resonate with being a diaspora, right? And so, and specifically the part of Toronto that we were engaging, which was the east end of downtown, Regent Park, St. Jamestown, very dense, large concentration of first-generation immigrants. At least, the day-to-day portion of ministry, not the weekend services and not the the preaching and the teaching, but just being with people and learning stories. I think being a diaspora, that connected quite a bit. The Sri Lankans in the neighborhood, the South Asians, and then obviously the East Asians I had a large affinity towards, and those were, I would say, it was transcendent. It at least transcended national boundaries, but it always forced me to think about, like, my job is to be an ambassador of the kingdom, not an ambassador of American religion or American Christianity. And I think that was helpful for me. And so I could draw on those motifs when we were ministering to immigrants, and it was also oftentimes a sort of a prophetic challenge to those who were 7, 8 generation European Canadians. And so I think probably where I related the most in terms of, like, Paul, Paul's able to claim his Roman citizenship when it was convenient, or to play up his Jewishness when it was convenient. Like, I understood that struggle a little bit more. I could capitalize a little bit more on my American sensibilities at times, and then other times I could play more into my immigrant identity. And I think that really helped me connect a lot with 52% of Torontonians who are not Canadian born.
You eventually transitioned back to the U.S. As you look back on your experience planting in Toronto, what are a couple of key insights that come to mind, or learning experiences, or what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, learning to do things with the community and the city, I think, was was really important. I think there was moments where, we're taught in church planting to do things for, or sometimes we're doing things for ourselves and not for the community. But even doing things for the community feels a little bit, still external. It's when you realize that you're doing things with the community, when you have church members sitting on community boards, or when the community is asking you to sit at their tables. That's when I felt like, wow, I think in a sense, this is incarnational ministry. You don't have to hide who you are, but people want you to be there because of who you are. And I think that was a big lesson for me. Could have learned that probably in any other ministry context, but I think being in Toronto when you're just not, at least we weren't, maybe other churches could have, and maybe other churches did, but we weren't going to plant that like fast growing church that was going to, grow to be your next, enterprise level church in downtown. But the wins were really that we were integrated with some of the other things that the city and community organizations were doing. I learned a lot about, that's kind of the first thing. The second thing I learned a lot about was, my power and agency of being an American. And let me make sure I don't say that the wrong way. But I had the option and the ability to like enter and re-enter Canada, and I could go across the border and go quote unquote home to my parents, and then come back. And I needed to do that anyways because my mom was ailing, and she eventually passed while I was in Toronto. But I realized that like that showed me like the importance that I was still very much an outsider, and I needed to respect that because I could still go back and forth across the border, and I had a place outside of Toronto that was at least felt like home for me, and that was in Detroit. And I think that that's something that as missionaries you carry. It's there's that passage in Hebrews chapter 11 where Paul says, eventually Abraham realizes that he was searching for a heavenly city. It was not found in the promised land on earth here. It was a heavenly city. And I realized that Toronto wasn't home for me, but when I came back to the States, Detroit wasn't home for me either. And so what I've learned in the process is that we're called to minister in these spaces, but ultimately we have a heavenly dwelling that we're looking for. And I miss Toronto, terribly. I was just there a few months ago, and I had a chance to pray the streets and meet with former church members and other people that we administer with. Love it tremendously. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at a picture right now across from me. Your listeners can't obviously tell, but it says Toronto City Partner, Send North America, Toronto. And so every time I sit in my office, I think about, our time in Toronto and miss it. And I realized that ultimately all of the work that we do in the cities that we're working in North America points to, the new Jerusalem, when heaven and earth will come. I'm really excited about that.
You went on to do some further academic study. I think you went on to get your doctorate. As you now have done more work on studying the church broadly, what have been your reflections on the Western church, and in particular on the Canadian church?
Yeah, so I part of my reason for coming back to the States was I was going to pursue PhD studies, and I couldn't do it in Toronto. I'd have to change my visa. And if I changed my visa, I couldn't pastor, or I couldn't stay at the church. And so there was obviously a lot of complications as somebody who's not Canadian. And so that meant I had to look at an American institution. And so I applied to one here in Chicago, Trinity, TEDS. Basically I'm still currently wrapping it up. I had some some health issues that put it on pause for some time, but in the middle of finishing my PhD studies in intercultural studies. And what I've really been looking at, Matt, over the last 6 years of my research and my study is this idea of missional narratives, that we have a biblical framework for what we're doing, especially in church planting. And then we also have a personal social framework for what we're doing. And so let's say, for instance, this is probably the most convenient one that I can describe. We often use the language of church decline to mobilize people into church planting or into mission. And this was especially true with Gen Xers. We would kind of harken back to this point in North America where more and more people went to church, or American culture or North American culture was more considered Christianized and whatnot. Whether or not that was true, that was the sentiment. And we say, but we need to plant more churches so that we can reach more people. And in a sense, that's a very localized narrative that applies to some people, but not to all people. And I think in Canada, it was interesting because the narratives are slightly different than some of the American narratives, but the ones that I think are very prominent, I talk about oftentimes the arrival narrative. And the arrival narrative is this idea that many of us have arrived in North American soil, not just as the mission field, but also as the mission force. That's very true for a city like Toronto, where some of the largest churches are immigrant churches, or whether it's some of the Korean churches or the Chinese church. I think about Brampton, not too far from where you live. My friends who are South Asian will often call it Browntown. And so you have to ask the question: why has God allowed this influx of the world to come to North America, Canada in particular, and a large number of them, not all of them, but a large number of them are already Christian? What is God doing there? And I think in some ways in Canada, some of the resurgence and revitalization that we're seeing is because of the global church that is arriving in Canada. And that's exciting. There are some seminaries that there were some seminaries that would close if it wasn't for the global church coming to the North American context. And then probably the only other thing that I'd say, and I want to be sure to say this carefully because I think the progressiveness of Canada was never scary to me. It doesn't feel as scary. I know to some people it's scary. To some Canadians it's scary. But to me, the progressiveness in general, but also the progressiveness in Canada, always felt to me like a curiosity for more. And I only understood it that way because all of us, if you lived in downtown Toronto, you only had progressive liberal neighbors around you. And I learned so much from their curiosity about the world, the questions that they would ask me, their consideration for my personal story. There were some that were turned off that I was a pastor, but by and large, I felt like there was a strong sense that they would never come to our church. But I think that there was a genuine sense that I can see the seeker in some of these people. And it reminded me that it was actually God at work in them, calling them up to something more than what they were experiencing. And that, to me, I felt like it was very much, I remember a phrase that a neighbor of mine had that we just shared Jesus with so much. And he would text me back at times and he would say, kind of the classic phrase, "I feel like the universe is speaking to me." And that never scared me, man. That just made me excited about what he's still stirring in Canada. And although they can't name that God, I know it doesn't mean that God's given up on them.
Speak to that reality a little bit more, because I think you're right. I think a lot of Christians, both in the U.S. and in Canada, can feel fearful about sort of the secularity and the progressivism. You and I met through Redeemer City to City's incubator training, and I recall following Tim Keller's death, a reflection on his life that he never saw as well the secular agenda or progressive realities as being something to be fearful of, but instead it wooed a heart of compassion towards what was beneath these realities or beneath these things that were on the surface. maybe speak to that a little bit more. Share an example from your time in Toronto or in other places where what was on the surface was one thing, but what was going on beneath the surface was something altogether different.
Yeah, I think probably the easiest issue when it came to at least understanding what was going on underneath people's hearts and their intentions was it when it came to dealing with human sexuality. I have a very clear, at least what I think, I'm very clear in what I understand the Bible to teach about human sexuality, and God's design for marriage, God's design for sex in the context of a covenant relationship between husband and wife. That very much is my conviction. We were doing, this is probably year one of the church, we were doing a relationship series around that. And naturally, you can tell, you can probably guess, it opened up a lot of questions, even for those who grew up in the church, but especially so for those who were visiting our gatherings who weren't yet Christians. And if I were to primarily process the questions that I was receiving at the time, whether, what about my sister or my brother, or, kind of all of those more emotionally oriented questions, if I were to process them primarily through the politics of the nation or the church politics of our denomination or the formal bylaws and policies of our local church, there was a great potential to dehumanize their experience. And then when you dehumanize somebody's experience, you have the tendency to demonize them. And so when you demonize somebody, you are less likely to want to share the gospel at a heart level. And rather you would, I'm not saying all people would do this, but the tendency of the religious person is to weaponize the gospel to show the person how inhumane they are or unhuman they are. Or, and mind you, none of this has to mean that you agree with their lifestyle or are adamantly against it. And I think that learning the stories of those who had chose their lifestyle gave me a deeper appreciation for how complex it is, how clear the Bible is, and how complex the human experience is. And that's a paradox. It's a paradox. And I don't think we should apologize for how clear the Bible is, but I don't think we can underestimate how complex the human experience is. This became more clear to me as I discovered members of my own family who had their own journeys in this area. And it didn't lessen the intensity and the demands of the gospel, in a sense, where Jesus, in a sense, calls us to die to ourselves. But it may be more of a better listener. And I think that is probably, to a large degree, one of the prophetic things that the culture is helping the church to accept, is that some of our best evangelism is going to happen when we take an empathetic posture of listening. Because after you're done listening, then people will ask you to engage. And that was really my experience. And so I share that, Matt. I'm already hearing people saying, "Oh, you're not preaching the gospel." And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I learned how to be a better listener in that environment, so that I can better communicate the gospel as hope and not as a legalist doctrine.
What are you studying? What are you learning? You talked about your PhD studies. What are you thinking as it relates to the future of the Western Church in particular? Are you feeling hopeful? Where are you at these days as it relates to the future of the church here in the West?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel hopeful. It's not a naive hope. It's also not like this hype man hope, where it's kind of like, let's take the hill type hope. I don't think the future of the Western church is that attitude of let's take the hill. I don't think it ever was, but at least in terms of like enterprise Christianity, which, we can blame it on Americans for exporting enterprise Christianity, or entrepreneurial Christianity, however way you want to talk about it. And so I think there's a bit of a polycentric Christianity that's emerging. I mentioned this earlier with the arrival narrative and global Christianity. That's exciting to me. I think Canada in particular and US as well, we're seeing probably some of the first mature versions of what it looks like to have a global church emerge and planted in North American soil. So we're talking about churches that go beyond just immigrant churches. We're talking about some people would use the phrase international church. I don't know if that quite gets at it, but it's a different church that emerges from North American soil that, there's obviously First Nations and indigenous churches, but then everybody else is an immigrant church that we've come in eventually, whether you're European or Southeast Asian like me. But now you're seeing like mature versions of the global church emerge. That's exciting to me because the social location is not primarily North America, Canada, US. It's kind of like what I've experienced from around the world. How do I bring that into my daily life? And then probably the only other thing that really gives me a lot of energy for the future is just the wisdom and the sensitivity of Gen Zers. I'm raised in a household full of them. They're much more empathetic than I am. They're much more realist. Sometimes they're, a bit sarcastic for me, but they're not, at least I don't feel like they're jaded like some previous generations. They're rightfully skeptical. They're entrepreneurial. I think they're going to be more collaborative. I think in some ways what we see as snowflakes, I've never called them snowflakes, but, marketers or whatever call them snowflakes. I think they're rightfully reflecting back to us the chaos of our culture, which means that they actually have a good pulse of the culture. And I look at my job right now, primarily, I'm 43. It's not like I'm old, but I look at my job primarily right now is to make sure that Gen Zers feel like they can have an optimistic voice. My friend, I'll end with this. My friend Brian Sanders, who founded the Tampa Underground and Microchurch Network, he says that in a world filled with cynics, the prophets are optimists. And I think there's something about the next generation that they're gonna leave behind a little bit of the cynicism and stop the deconstruction, and they'll start building.
Daniel, as we close, how can our listeners be thinking and praying for you?
The big thing that I'm really focused on these days is three things. One, that helping to tell the story of mission to Gen Z. So prayers for that we would see a lot of our work really giving a healthy urgency to the next generation. Two, seeing networks of churches that are started from like conspicuous or marginal spaces. I think that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation happen. And then three, hanging out with guys like you, Matt. I think the future is going to be imagined by emerging thought leaders. And I think that as much as we need practitioners, we need people to do for the next generation for what Alan Hirsch or others did for us. And I'm very interested in seeing more of those rooms put together, because I think we can only create models as good as the frameworks that they exist in, and we need better frameworks. So I'm excited for emerging thought leaders.
Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today on the Sowers Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Friends, there is so much to glean from this conversation with Daniel. As I went back and re-listened to the interview, however, I kept thinking about Daniel's comment about social layers versus the image of God. Daniel shared that if we see people through social layers, we'll be more prone to dehumanize and demonize, which means then we'll be less likely to share the gospel with people, and we may even try to weaponize it. He said that we need to become better listeners so that we can communicate a gospel of hope versus communicating a legalist doctrine. Daniel's challenge was to see people as people made in the image of God, as those bearing the Imago Dei. Where in your world In the relationships that you find yourself in, are you tempted to create social layers or to buy into the social layers that are happening in the culture around us? And again, when you see people through social layers, you fail to see them as individuals made in the image of God. It may make sense for you to get out a journal and write down some of these social layers and then begin praying that God would change your heart, change your mind to see people as beings made in the image of God so that you can be a better listener and communicate the gospel as hope. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to this conversation. If this was an encouragement to you, I would encourage you to share it, subscribe, provide a rating on whatever platform you are using. You are loved.